The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on. Ideas have endurance without death.
60 years ago, President John F. Kennedy's administration came to a sudden and tragic end, but the legacy he left behind continues today. I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. And in this episode, we will take a look at how the ideas President Kennedy championed during his administration live on. Next on Let Us Begin, A Legacy Continued.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
For the last 7 episodes, we have touched on different pillars of President Kennedy's legacy, from public service, civil rights, peace and diplomacy, arts and culture, and science and innovation. In our last episode of this special series, we will bring all those pieces together as we look ahead to how the work from JFK's administration has lived on through today.
Our first guest represents many of those pillars in his work. NASA astronaut Victor Glover's experience includes service as a U.S. Navy captain while serving on the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy. He also spent time as a Navy test pilot and later worked in the halls of Congress as a legislative fellow in Washington, D.C., before being accepted to the astronaut program in 2013.
As an astronaut, Glover has served on the International Space Station, spending 168 days in space. He will be on the Artemis II mission, which will be the first crewed mission back to the moon in more than 50 years. Glover will also be the first Black astronaut to travel to the moon in American history. Captain Glover, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Victor, this podcast is about the legacy of President Kennedy, the 60th year of his administration, and there's a lot we want to talk about, particularly in your role as an Artemis II pilot, the next generation of astronauts to the moon. But before we get to what you're doing now, we want to talk a little bit about the past and your relationship to it. For you, it seems to us by what we've read about you, you really identify a lot with what happened in the civil rights struggle of the 1960s and 70s. If you want to start by just telling us a little bit about your family story. I think your grandfather was denied the ability to fly in the Korean War. If you want to talk about how that struggle for civil rights from the era of the 60s and later 70s impacts you, please, we'd love to start there at this conversation.
Absolutely. First of all, I think we're all connected to it. Whether we know a lot of the details of the movement era, we are all connected and affected by it today. And so, you mentioned my grandfather. My grandfather was in the Air Force during the Korean conflict era, and he did not want to fly. It was not his desire to fly. But I do highlight that it was almost impossible for him. The Tuskegee experiment that we now look back on and applaud, and we love to highlight it nowadays. It was actually a very controversial program at the time, and it was actually a setup for failure. They were hoping that those Black pilots would perform miserably. They gave them terrible aircraft, no maintenance support, not many logistics support, and it was expected to fail, and they performed very well against the odds. And so it was not it wasn't really seen as an opportunity at the time. We celebrate it now, but it was a really challenging situation during the Tuskegee Airmen's operations. And so to now be a military pilot, a test pilot, and now to fly to space for my country, it's just a really interesting sign of progress where our country has gone since then. But also we have work to do. Things have gotten better, obviously. I am the beneficiary of the work of my grandfather and my father's generation, but I am also well aware, eyes wide open, that we have lots of work to do, and we still need to continue to push for greater freedom and inclusion for people. And so, we can go into some more detail about that, but it very much is personal for me as well.
And to stay in the history just for a little bit, Ed Dwight, the first black astronaut recruited in the Kennedy administration, but never made it all the way to the astronaut corps, and obviously not into the not flying into space. There was a lot of controversy with him, and just as you said, a lot of struggle with black astronauts to try to get in, first black pilots to get in the air, and then, of course, Ed Dwight's story of trying to get into space. Do you know much about his story, and what does that mean for you, thinking about following in footsteps of people like Ed Dwight?
I've known Ed since 2006, and I have his book. I was actually looking on my shelf to see it. I have his book over there about a yard, and it's really interesting. I know the story. There's a recent documentary made about this, and it was so powerful for me to see a video of him doing a press conference after President Kennedy was assassinated. And he was standing out on the tarmac, just stepped out of an airplane, and just seemed really dejected and sad. And for the first time, I felt how, or at least what I thought would be how alone he felt. And I've known about this story for years, but to see a video of him as a young man, younger than I am now, dealing with that was really powerful and profound for me. So I do know the story, but there's always more to know. And, I look at Ed's situation again as a growth opportunity to be able to go to space. And I was able to take a small item of Ed's with me to the International Space Station and then bring it back for him, just as a sign of, I am definitely standing on his shoulders and able to be here because of what he did and the courage that he had to continue in the face of that challenge. But I'm very familiar with that story, and I think it's getting a lot of attention now because it starts back when Charlie Bolden became the administrator of NASA. He brought Ed to his Senate confirmation hearing, and that confirmation hearing really started this journey of making sure that people understand that history, which is whether I don't like putting labels on history. It's not Black history. That's American history, or just the history of time that people need to know. I think it's a story that, again, affects all of us, and we should all be aware of it.
Thank you. And one thing that I read in preparing for this is that you have a reading list, I think, that you like to share with your colleagues. And one of the things on the list is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail that he wrote in April 1963. What is it about that letter that you encourage your coworkers to read that?
Because it's masterfully written and maybe one of the best distillations of Dr. King's urgency. I think people are familiar with the bullet points, but I think maybe they forget the urgency that he tried to communicate in that letter. And so he was writing it to clergy and to addressing rabbis, and it was just really interesting to read that one specific letter, and then to know that he penned it while in jail. That is just a very unique, that letter. And then his speech, I've been to the mountaintop, his last speech before he was assassinated, those don't get as much airplay as the I Have a Dream speech. And it's just really, I think it just really speaks a little bit sometimes to our tendency to be ahistorical in America. Those two things should get as much or more airtime than the I Have a Dream speech, because they're just so relevant to what we're doing today. And I don't want to take this out of context. I don't share that letter, that thing for people to read by itself. It is in a list of things that create a picture and an understanding, again, of the broader sense of our country. To kind of go back to another historical figure, Carter Woodson, the gentleman who created Negro History Week, which we now celebrate as Black History Month. When he wrote why he started that, he said, it is not that we should study Negro history, but the Negro in history. What we need is not the history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of bias. And that's the point. I share that letter because as the ambassadors of human spaceflight, we need to understand the breadth of our country and the breadth of our history and the breadth of our communities to really, truly be ambassadors of the NASA mission. And so that is on a list that starts with the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is the first thing on the list, but not many people have actually read it. Like the Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 still says, for purposes of representation and taxation, we will count all free men, but everyone else will be 3/5 of a person. And so, that's a piece of our history that we need to remember. Like, that is still ours today. And we amend the Constitution, which means to make it better or to take out blemishes. We don't erase it and rewrite it to forget that piece. We make it better. And it's important that those words are still in there as a reminder of where we've come from, but also of where we have to go.
Thank you. And another piece that seems really important to you specifically, and then I think it's also interesting piece in and of itself, is Gil Scott Heron's Whitey on the Moon. I've read that you listen to that twice a week. And how has that been such an influence or important to you? And is there any part of it that has a particular meaning?
Marvin Gaye also has a song, "Makes Me Want to Holler" is the subtitle to it. But the reason that those pieces of media, again, it's putting together this mosaic of our country. We think of Apollo, we think of the 1960s, and we think of it's like the "I Have a Dream" speech kind of bubbles up to the top, and we lose the gritty, grainy, true picture of what it was like back then. When we went to the moon, there was a lot of cheering and support, but there was also the other side of it. People who said, "Why are we spending all this money on going to space, putting people on the moon?" And all those people happened military men, except for Jack Schmidt. And so it was something that other people had some challenge, some difficulty understanding. And for me, that poem and Marvin Gaye's song are reminders that everyone's not just going to jump in and say, let's do that. Everybody's not jumping in and going to row the boat the same direction. And it makes us better stewards of public resources and advocates of STEM education and public service if we understand that. And it's not about getting into debates and trying to argue with people. It's about just understanding the issues that are out there and being sensitive to the challenges facing Americans, right? America is not one thing. It's all these states joined together, and we need to understand some of those other communities. And that Gil Scott Heron poem is a very clear, short, and it's actually funny, it's very humorous reminder that in the 60s, when we were going to the moon, everybody wasn't just cheering "Go NASA." In fact, a lot more people were focused on the Vietnam War and soldiers coming back to this country after that really tragic era in our country's history. And so it just helps me to communicate that we have a lot to learn. And when we go to the moon this time, we need to continue to be in that learning and growth mindset and not just assume everybody is excited about what we're doing, but be there to answer questions or just to listen and be empathetic to the challenges that people are facing.
And thinking about the Apollo crew and the preceding programs, that group of astronauts, as you mentioned, was pretty homogenous. They had lots of background, whereas all very similar. Can you talk about kind of the lack of Black astronauts and pilots in the moon missions and what it means to be on the Artemis 2 crew now?
Our country was just in a different place, to try to put that simply. And it was just okay for it to be all white men, military, male, test pilot, English speaking Christians. That just was the office. And I wouldn't even say homogenous. They picked the same person. Their ages were very close. And we joke about Air Force versus Navy versus Marine pilots, but outside of that group, they all look the same from the outside. And so it's really important to me that we pick an office that represents the best and brightest of our STEM workforce, which represents not as well as it could, but we're trying to change that, but it represents our country. And so our office now better represents the America that we represent. And that is because of decisions people were making 10, 20 years ago to try and increase diversity in STEM, to try and increase diversity and inclusion at NASA, and to try and increase diversity in our astronaut corps, in our representatives of human spaceflight. And so to be on this crew, for me, is a little bit of a sign of progress, but also a beacon in where we need to go and continue to work on this. It is a challenging dichotomy to sit here and to say, like, listen, I'm not on this crew because I'm Black. But the fact that I'm Black is a benefit to the crew because I represent a part of our country that is underrepresented in these endeavors. And I also know that going out there are people who are going to change the channel, change the station, or not care, or even attack NASA because we're talking about this. But you know what? When we come back from the moon and we land in the Pacific Ocean successfully, and we have a good mission that enables the Artemis 3 and the subsequent landing on the moon, it will be in the history books, and people will remember that we did it together. And hopefully these tough conversations that we're having now will produce the mission success that we seek, and that will be enough for the people who maybe don't want to talk about inclusion and diversity. Well, when we show up and we do the mission well, and we do it well because we brought in different backgrounds and different perspectives, then maybe that'll be enough for people later. And so it is important to me. I understand the complexity and the makeup of our crew and how important that is to the Artemis program. But I also know that at the end of the day, we have a mission to accomplish. And I want America and Canada and all of our Artemis Accords partners and really humans all over the planet to know we're going to the moon for you. And this is the right crew, because this is what our office looks like. If you just grab 4 people out, it's going to look like our crew. It wasn't a stunt to just put up a diversity campaign. This is our office. And I want you to have trust in this crew. These are the right people. And the next crew will be the right people as well.
You just mentioned people are going to see you guys for what you did when you land in the Pacific. And that brings me to the thought of role models. Who were the type of role models that influenced you to pursue a role, not only as a test pilot, but to get into the space program?
Well, I have to go back to way before that. So my mother and my father's support and encouragement just, kept me moving along the lines of math and science. I've always loved math. Math spoke to me. But, there weren't many forces in my community saying, yes, you can do that, grow into that, keep that. My community was telling me that I could be a good athlete. And I did continue with athletics, but my parents said, hey, that education is important. So start it with mom and dad. And then I had teachers like my 5th grade science teacher, Mr. Hargrove, who said, hey, you keep this up, one day you might become a great engineer. And I didn't know what it meant. I thought he was talking about driving trains, but his belief in me still to this day is why I have 3 engineering degrees. I held on to that all these years. And Mr. Hargrove changed the course of my life. Robin Ikeda, my AP biology teacher in high school, same thing. I took AP biology twice. I passed it the first time. I just took the class again because I loved it so much. She was a role model and still is a good friend and mentor. Gerald Robinson, my high school calculus teacher, Dr. Dan Walsh, my advisor in undergrad. I could list name after name. Before I even got into this spacefaring business, those folks helped me carve out a path of a science and technology workforce job that meant something to me. And I'm now a pilot, and I got to go to test pilot school. And that's when I started to learn about these names, people like John Young and John Glenn. And here's the thing. If I had to pick one astronaut who influenced me more than any other, well, it's hard to do. I don't have favorites or best, but Alan Bean, who flew on Apollo, but also was a Skylab mission commander, was a great influence on me. And he's not brown. He's not a brown astronaut, but I definitely was influenced by the first Black astronaut, Guy Bluford, Dr. Guy Bluford, good friend and mentor now. I got to speak to him while I was in space. And actually all of the Black astronauts that there are now are good friends, and we speak regularly. Charlie Bolden, I worked for him when he was a Marine general and I was learning to fly the F-18. And so hopefully this answer just shows you it's a community. It wasn't 1 or 2 people. It was a community of people who supported and believed in these dreams and helped me to take the right steps to get here.
And so what is it going to be like for you, knowing that as the first Black astronaut to go that far to the moon, that you'll be a role model for others?
I don't think about that a lot right now. And when I come into contact with that after this mission, I'm going to do the best thing that I can. I'm going to try to do what's right, lead with my heart, and try to just be supportive of other people chasing and catching their dreams. If you had asked John Glenn what it was going to be like for him after, I'm not sure how he would answer that question. And, the fact that our history is peppered with people like John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, but I can't project into that. I don't know if Neil Armstrong thought about what it was going to be like to be the Neil Armstrong that we all know of because he stepped on the moon. So I don't really know how to answer that question, but I do know this. I have children that are chasing their dreams and I want to help them and cheer them on. And I have a lot of mentors and mentees that I want to continue to support. And in any way that this mission can influence that, or my role as an astronaut or as a military officer or a dad or a husband can support that, then I'm going to try to do the best thing I can to continue to serve my country and humanity.
And thinking about President Kennedy, he kind of coined the term moonshot, the idea of doing something so great that it seems impossible. And what would be your moonshot as we're talking about Artemis 2 and going to the moon and all of these exciting endeavors?
Well, I guess I will answer that literally and figuratively. Literally, it'll be when we splash down in the Pacific and this mission was a success and therefore enables the next mission and really the journey of Artemis, which is to get us to the moon, to the surface, to the moon, space station, and on to Mars. And so a successful Artemis campaign that the public continues to support, that gets us further in deep space. Our generation will get its own literal moonshots. And I love that. I quote President Kennedy all the time. But then figuratively, I think for me personally, it is just to encourage greater critical thinking. I would love to see greater importance of data and history and fact. There's so much division in the world today that I think could be obliterated by a little fact and a little humility and us being a little more patient with each other. And so for me, a moonshot would be anything that I can do to contribute to that. This Artemis 2 crew represents an international partnership. It represents diversity within our country and between our country and other countries. And everything that we can do to create greater cooperation, I think would be good. Thinking about the time when President Kennedy was in office, there was this really interesting period, the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. And something very influential to me, another book I have here somewhere, is The Paranoid Style of American Politics, written by historian Richard Hofstadter. And essentially, to summarize that book, politicians in the 60s transitioned from becoming masters of compromise to becoming masters of conflict. And I think you see that today. Our politics has become something really challenging. And it's really a shame because George Washington, the first president of this union, when he left office, he wrote this thing, his farewell speech, but he didn't actually speak it. He published it in the newspaper. But his farewell speech warned us of a bunch of things. And one of those was political division. Actually, another one, which is really important right now, is foreign influence in our politics. And so you look at those things and you go, listen, if we just could quiet our own opinions, put a little bit of history out front, put truth and data and fact, and then the logical, rational conclusions that you draw from that, if we could put that up front and take some of the ego and opinion and divisiveness out of it, that would be the real moonshot for me. And I think that's what the world needs more of. Love, love, love.
And so, thinking we've talked about Whitey on the moon and people saying, even then, why are we going to the moon? Why are we spending this money? We have urgent needs here on Earth. So kind of similarly today, some people might say the same thing about going to the moon now. What do you say to skeptics about kind of who don't think that manned space travel is a luxury that we can afford?
Jamie, that's a great question. Thank you for setting that up, because the most important thing I will say is I don't always say anything. I think the most important thing that I can do is listen. I listen more than I respond to those folks. If they want to know what we do with the investments at NASA, I've got the data. I can tell them how 300 to 700% increases on the investments we make in NASA in our academic and industrial base is pretty consistent over the last 20 years. But that's not the point. I'm not trying to start a debate. Sometimes people bring those things up because they want to make sure that our leaders know. And whether we like it or not, from the day you become an astronaut, even if you could be 28 years old, you could be 58, you are a public official, a very visible public official. And so sometimes people just want to know that those higher ups, those figureheads know what's happening to them locally. And so I listen. I won't always respond. Sometimes all I can do is go, yep, potholes, clean water. You know what? Like, potholes is a joking term we use. You know what? There are Americans right now that have difficulty accessing clean water on a regular basis. This is a problem we can solve. On the International Space Station right now, we just had a record period where we were able to reclaim 98% of our water. I don't know if you know what that means. When I sweat, spit, pee, and poop on the International Space Station, we drain the water from all that, clean it, put acid in it, put minerals in it to make it taste good, but we reuse the water. We jokingly say we turn yesterday's coffee into tomorrow's coffee. That technology is making life better here on Earth, but we still have people right now that have difficulty accessing clean drinking water in America, okay? These are challenges that we are well suited to tackle. NASA is well suited to tackle these problems. We have to encourage our corporate partners to pick up some of these ideas and make them accessible. But we are trying to solve problems that are meaningful here on Earth. But that's not always the point. I will share the good news of NASA with people if they want to know. But if they just want to make sure that we hear them, then I'm a listening ear and I try to listen with my heart.
That is so wonderful. And just the idea of taking what we've done and recycling it for tomorrow is just, in today's society, so promising and hopeful. The last question we want to ask, the title of this podcast is Let Us Begin, which is a quote from President Kennedy's inaugural address. Towards the end of the speech, he kind of says, all this will not be complete in the first 100 days, nor in the first 1,000, nor in the life of his administration. And, this podcast, this episode is going to be airing around the 60th anniversary of his death when he died. We want to ask you, in that spirit of let us begin and that the things will not be finished, what do you think the work JFK has left for all of us to do? What is the work that you think is still left to do?
Wow, there's a lot, but I think it all involves love. People talk about this job and thank us for our bravery and our courage. I think one of the most important attributes that you have when you're an astronaut, a space explorer, a military person who goes into combat is actually love. I mean, I know those words don't get as much airtime as the toughness and the bravery and the chivalry, but love is a big part of why we do what we do. And so finding ways to make love a greater part of the conversation is something that whatever we're talking about, the technological healthcare problems, having more green space, clean air, clean water. When we talk about using public resources to tackle those problems, we have to share. A basic thing that we've been taught since we were kids. We have to share, and we have to be willing to. And I think we have to make sure that we're starting with love. And so I do think it's really visionary, though, for a leader to admit it's really easy to try to attach things to political cycles, and that creates expectation. It's supposed to be done in 2 years, in 4 years, in 6 years. But the things that we're talking about changing, making better for our community are things that are really a journey. It's not a destination. It's not about fixing this one thing and then sitting on our hands because we succeeded. It's about continuing to grow and be better and to evolve society and civilization towards greater states of peace and prosperity. Like all of our founding documents say, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of these United States, to live up to those values, we all have to be willing to sign up to begin, to start and take steps, knowing when I leave this earth, we're going to still need to take steps. It doesn't mean, though, that I shouldn't take any of those steps. Martin Luther King said something very similar in that last speech before he was assassinated, that he may not get there with us. And as sad as that made some people, it was an encouragement to keep going. I'm going to tell you before I'm gone to keep going. And so I think those are two sides of a similar coin. Let us begin. The work we have in front of us is necessary, and we had better get started. And it's not going to be wrapped up in a nice bow by the time I'm done doing the work, but keep going. Please keep going, because it's about all of us and humanity being in a better position in the end.
I don't think you could have summed up JFK's message there more perfectly. Victor, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to following your travels across to the other side of the moon. Good luck with the trip.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt, Jamie. I really enjoyed the interview, and I'm going to check out the podcast, and I really, really look forward to learning some more about what you guys are doing. Thank you for letting me be a part.
Thank you. This was excellent.
Thank you. Nearly 16 years after President John F. Kennedy's administration, President Jimmy Carter, members of the Kennedy family, and many others from all walks of life came to the dedication and opening of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum.
And we face these times when centrifugal forces in our society and in our political system as well, forces of regionalism, forces of ethnicity, of narrow economic interest, of single-issue politics, are testing the resiliency of American pluralism and of our ability to govern. But we can and we will prevail. The problems are different. The solutions, none of them easy, are also different. But in this age of hard choices and scarce resources, the essence of President Kennedy's message, the appeal for unselfish dedication to the common good, is more urgent than it ever was. The spirit that he evoked the spirit of sacrifice, of patriotism, of unstinting dedication is the same spirit that will bring us safely through the adversities that we face today. The overarching purpose of this nation remains the same: to build a just society in a secure America, living at peace with the other nations of the world. The library that we dedicate today is a symbol, above all, of that unchanging purpose. Through our study here of his words and his deeds, the service of President Kennedy will keep its high place in the hearts of many generations of America to come after us.
Today, we are joined by the current caretakers of President Kennedy's legacy. Alan Price, the JFK Presidential Library's 6th permanent director, began serving the library in 2018. And Rachel Flor, executive director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that helped build the library and now continues to support its education, public programs, and other initiatives. Rachel has been serving with the foundation for 17 years and began serving as executive director in 2019. Alan and Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Wonderful to have this conversation.
So we want to talk about President Kennedy's legacy 60 years later. And I guess we'll start, first question for you both. What does JFK's legacy mean for both of you 60 years after his administration?
Well, as someone who has worked at the JFK Library Foundation now for 16 years, which is kind of hard for me to believe, President Kennedy's legacy has meant a lot of things to me over the years. There's a lot of different kind of public policy pieces that he committed to and was able to move forward that I admire and are meaningful. But I tend to really focus these days on his leadership and just looking at different aspects of his leadership and how he handled challenging situations and was able to lead the country through some pretty tough times. And that is, something I think we all feel and face today. And having that history is helpful, I think, to look back on as we face some pretty difficult situations ourselves.
So much to say. In one of President Kennedy's speeches, I believe it was the Democratic Convention speech, the 1960 in Los Angeles, where he talks about, my apologies. No, it's in the debate with Nixon that he refers to the central question is whether America can exist half slave and half free. And I think it's a marvelous historic context where he's in some ways not only directly challenging the Cold War and can capitalism and communism in some ways coexist or compete, but there's also a domestic crisis around what is typically called the civil rights struggle. But he refers to Abraham Lincoln, and I think he captures in very few words the challenge that America has always struggled with the issues that we feel today, that the world has for many years struggled with the issues that we experience today, and that's why I think he's still relevant today. Kennedy recognized that all those issues weren't resolved before he took office. They couldn't be resolved during his time in office. They might not be resolved in his lifetime, and so we still are wrestling with those issues today.
And is there any part of JFK's life or parts of his history that resonates with either of you most or more often as you're doing your work here?
As complicated as it is, I love focusing on President Kennedy as a young person. And we see so many images of him growing up, his formative experiences, his family life in the White House. I think the unprecedented media access, it not only humanizes him and his administration and his family for the U.S., I think it humanizes the U.S. for the world symbolically. And I'm grateful that we have that historic record in images so that we can more easily remember that time and I think more easily appreciate a world that happened before the internet and the things that we take for granted in terms of media but still photography and video images have a candor to them that I think people appreciate.
I think for me, and again, my sort of relationship with the history has evolved over time as well, and I think that tends to happen with people in as contexts change. But and I admire a lot about what he accomplished, certainly in the areas of civil rights, was able to move forward. One aspect of his administration that has kind of captured my imagination more recently is just his commitment to doing hard things and being able to commit the country to an audacious goal to get to the moon and actually, and not just sort of say it, but do it and figure out the different mechanics. And in our archives, it's really interesting to be able to kind of see some of those early mechanics and getting the wheels in motion for ultimately getting the country to the moon before the end of the decade. And we face just like so much bureaucracy today, and it seems so hard to reach those types of goals today. So it's incredibly fascinating to me to imagine that he could make that commitment and get there. The other thing that I've just always gravitated towards with President Kennedy is that he is a student of history. He was a student of history, I should say, and so we're an institution here that's dedicated to history, and I think he embodied that spirit, that the history is, meaningful in contemporary life, that there are lessons to be learned from history that we can apply as we look to lead a country or a community or, an institution forward. And so I just always I love those little reminders in our archive where he is looking back at people in history who he admired and applying kind of those values and strategies in his own administration.
And we have the museum right below us. And whenever you get a chance to go through, what's one of the more powerful parts of it for both of you?
So my favorite there's a lot, I have a lot of favorite exhibits, but in terms of documents, there's speaking of sort of the moonshot, in our moonshot exhibit, if you look in this kind of dark corner of the exhibit, there's a one-page document from President Kennedy that he's writing to his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, very early on in his administration, basically, one page, 6 questions, essentially saying, are we doing enough to be first in space? And if not, why not? And it's the kind of memo that I feel like if you got as an employee, you'd be like, oh God, is he serious about this? And then next to it in the exhibit, there's a 6-page memo back from Johnson. And it's basically 6 pages of saying, like, we're definitely not ready to get there. And it ends with, we're neither making maximum effort nor achieving necessary results. And if you think about that, in 2 months later, basically, I could be wrong, it's maybe not exactly 2 months, but very short while later, President Kennedy comes and addresses Congress on urgent national needs and asks for the funding to build the space program, and then a year later is committing the country to achieving to getting to the moon. But it all goes back to that little memo where Johnson's like, we just aren't going to get there. And I love seeing that history in action. There's so much that I love on display currently, and we have so many more documents and objects that we could display and we'll never get to display. But 2 of my favorites are very much connected. One is I love the coconut and the story of PT 109 and the bravery and the survival, and I just think how lucky he was to have survived that moment.
And you might want to just mention what the coconut is, because some people may not know the story.
So to make that story short, when the Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, splits PT-109 in half, and the U.S. Navy thinks that all are lost, and 2 crew members are lost, and 1 is badly burned, and they swim and they survive for 6 days living off of coconuts, and they are found by Solomon Islanders who are working as scouts for the Australian Navy, and with, I'm sure, some charades demonstrate that you could carve a message into a coconut husk, and he does so, and it essentially says there's 11 alive on Noro Island, the native knows the position, need a small boat, Kennedy. And this Solomon Islander swims it out to an Australian ship who relays the message to the U.S. Navy so they know to look and find them. But the husk is preserved, and his father has it made into a paperweight, which he carries throughout his career, and it's on the Resolute desk in the Oval Office while he is president. And I think it's one of those, if you talk about the making of a superhero moment, without that husk just embodies the amount of chance necessary to have survived that moment. And then on the other side of it, not many people realize that the commander of the Amagiri had given his helmsman a direct order to avoid collision because you never know what might happen. There's torpedoes and the like on a PT boat. His helmsman disobeys a direct order and is later court-martialed for it, and the commander of the Amagiri reaches out, and they become lifelong friends, Kennedy and the commander, and he actually travels to the U.S. to campaign for him for president. And then when he is elected president, the still surviving crew members of the Amagiri all sign a note congratulating him. And I think it's just a wonderful document demonstrating that peace and reconciliation is possible between 2 former war adversaries.
And I think it's not just so people know, it's not like just a document. It's a really beautiful work of art, almost what was presented.
Yes, absolutely. In having lived in Japan for a year, it is a distinctive Japanese style and aesthetic that goes with it.
And we'll have that on our website for this episode so everyone can enjoy taking a look. Another question we have is, President Kennedy's administration, in terms of other administrations, was pretty short, unfortunately, due to what happened. Why do you think his administration remains so memorable in many people's eyes, despite, it being a relatively short administration?
I'll give 2 answers. One more about image and one more about substance. Obviously, because there's such a photo and video record of him, and he is a young man, and his life is cut short, that so many people grieve the loss of youth symbolically and really wish he could have lived a full life to see what happened. I think he's sort of frozen in time in that way. But in terms of substance, he both delivered so much in terms of policy in a short period of time and left us with such inspiring rhetoric that is still relevant today that I think there's a disproportionate impact for those 3 years than you might expect from a president, certainly a young president who, he's demonstrating a bit of a learning curve there at the beginning, but he does brilliantly with the time that he has.
And I think Alan said that so well. The only thing I would add is that President Kennedy, in his leadership, brought a very different style to the country. So instead of presenting his policies and sort of trying to win over the American people about what he was going to do for the country, we all know that the famous lines in his inaugural address, but ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But that was really what his administration was built off of. So, and it mobilized hundreds of thousands of people across the country to serve in many different ways. And because those people who were serving as part of the administration, maybe not as official parts of the administration, but really answering his call to serve, I think there was a different level of investment from a generation in his administration. And that's what I see has been passed down from that generation to children and grandchildren is sort of a commitment and a feeling that they'd been, for the first time, really part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's another reason that we see the longevity of his vision and his legacy.
And I want to piggyback on that because while many generations learn about service through their military service, and certainly President Kennedy validated that for so many people, but his starting of the Peace Corps. So now generations and thousands of Americans come to appreciate what they can do for their country and the world through the Peace Corps. It's a tremendous legacy.
And Alan, as director of the JFK Library, which is a presidential library, part of the National Archives system, what is it like being a steward of the archives here, JFK's presidential papers, personal papers, as historians and others use them to look back at anniversaries and other events from the period?
We take such great pride in our stewardship and making the record accessible, not just to researchers and doctoral candidates and professional historians, but to everyday Americans who want to see the original records. We serve that, and we love that. And many people access that through our museums, and we put out some slice of that, and we try to rotate that and keep it fresh. But other people will pick up that curiosity, whether a group of high school students or others will come through and say, can you show us the box of letters regarding XYZ topic? And they'll go through it and see history as it unfolded, as the Kennedy administration would have experienced it directly, pro and con on every issue he faced. And you can, I think, more immediately experience how divided the nation is always on most issues, and issues where President Kennedy really demonstrated leadership. You can see how the difficult context in which he says, this is the way we're going to go.
And how does the library play a role in helping us understand not just President Kennedy and his history, but history of the time period of his administration?
Well, we curate the objects of that time, and we are particularly careful in the museum to try and make it so that any visitor not only experiences Kennedy and the family and the political legacy, but what was that time period like? What sorts of things were in people's homes at the time? What kinds of things ran on television at the time? Things like that. So you could appreciate it in that context. To see the first televised presidential debates and see it in black and white and know that that was the new media of the day, whereas people are probably wondering, why didn't they just get on Instagram and get their messages out? This was the new media of that time. I think you can very quickly find yourself immersed in 1960 or earlier, depending on which part of the exhibit you're focused on, and understand it in its own context.
And while the library remains focused on preserving the 20th century icon and his history, Rachel, we're moving into the 21st century, and what do you see as the role of the foundation as continuing to further President Kennedy's legacy into the next century?
Well, I think we really build off of the work that the presidential libraries do to preserve the history and to make it accessible. And, I'll put a plug in for that work in that public history, the federal system there. I think some of us as Americans take for granted that we have a system of public history and access to federal records. And, especially for everyday Americans, the presidential libraries are places where you can actually show up and see firsthand, primary sources. And for a democracy that's built on access to the truth and the information, it's really a vital part of our democracy. So I'm grateful for that work of my colleagues on the library side. And then it's our job on the foundation side to really expand access to the materials, we do a lot of work around accessibility in terms of digital accessibility, so digitizing the materials, creating access points. Basically, we want to make sure that even if you can't come to the library, there's ways for people to access the history, and we basically have to go to the people. So we go out to, telling stories, doing storytelling on Instagram and social media, other social media platforms, also making our public programs accessible, so providing a platform for public dialogue around issues that President Kennedy, either, issues of history or issues that remain relevant today. And I think it really just, I see our mission as going back to what I said previously about making history relevant. So President Kennedy knew that history, as a student of history, it would be instructive and meaningful to better understand where our nation's been so that we can move forward in the best way possible. And so this is a small part of our nation's history, but it's a lot happened during those 3 years. And the foundation just tries in lots of interesting and creative ways to provide access points for people in this country and all over the world to that history.
If I could just add, and I love the partnership between the federal side and the foundation side. The federal side is by nature and by mission really good at responding to requests. And I think the foundation has more latitude and more vision around affirmatively promoting the access and the message so that the audiences grow, and we're here for them. So I think that works really well. And as an example that you are certainly aware of, if we can put out this bit of history and it happens to relate to current events, and sometimes that goes viral, that's an exciting moment for us because it's an example of we preserve these documents and they are relevant today, and now many people can see that. I think that's extraordinary.
One of the examples that more recent examples of making that history relevant is in our partnership with the Earthshot Prize that we had last year. And the Earthshot Prize was started by Prince William in the UK as a global prize to create optimism around sustainable solutions to repair the planet by the end of the decade. And what's so interesting about the effort is that it was all inspired by President Kennedy's moonshot speech, where he committed the country to getting to the moon by the end of the decade. So it shows that there's a leader who's using their platform. They've looked back at this moment in history and challenge in a leadership moment, taken inspiration from it and applied it to, what I think is the greatest challenge that we face in our time, and that's the issues of climate change and environment. So you can see where, even if it's not apples to apples, where we're not talking about the space race here, there's a lot that can be learned from a leader, a president, a former president, and kind of taken into the 21st century and applied to the issues that we face in our time.
And so this was 60 years ago we're thinking about, and so that means the kind of living memory of President Kennedy is diminishing as time goes on. What are the challenges of sharing this legacy? As you say, it may not seem relevant to people, but as we're talking about it, it is. How do you go about sharing that when there's, fewer living memories of him?
Well, it's certainly made easier when you have a president and family that are so photogenic and the rhetoric is so timeless and beautiful. It's a lot easier to make the case that this should matter to you today. And I think because things like the Peace Corps and other acts of legislation resonate, particularly, for example, the Rice University speech and talking about we're going to put a man on the moon in an era where that was not a scientific certainty that we could do such a thing, is so inspirational around courage that we have found that he has inspired people across all partisan lines to do better, to serve more. When newly elected members of Congress or newly elected mayors come to the Kennedy School to learn how to govern. They come to us as well and have a dinner and go through our experience, and they're all inspired. And I always say, when you go back to actually governing and partisan politics kick in, you're going to be discouraged at times. And if you need to come back to us for more inspiration, please come back. I think President Kennedy's words will continue to inspire for hundreds of years to come.
I agree. I think that it's a bit of an existential challenge, I guess, for any presidential library, where no matter what, your president is, with every passing day, becoming more and more a part of history. So it's important to us to stay part of contemporary discussions, and we do that by really understanding our history so that as contemporary issues unfold, we can help people, usually, through social media, again, going to where they are, to discover how, that history might be relevant to that particular situation today. One of the foundation's, I would say, marquee program is the Profile and Courage Award, where we extend the work that President Kennedy, or then, Congressman Kennedy, did in his book, Profiles in Courage, where he profiled 8 senators who had taken a difficult stand for the greater good despite the consequences. And we have a committee that chooses a contemporary example of Profile in Courage each year and honor them. And that's, been a very effective way of introducing President Kennedy in a contemporary political context and really helping both the elected officials, the goal is to try to inspire them to lead with courage, and also to help constituencies understand how important political courage is and in their own elected officials. So I would say it's a challenge, but it's the most interesting part of the job, is introducing a historic figure to new generations, each of whom have different priorities and interests and look at the world in a different way. And I've yet to experience a generation that hasn't responded with interest to learning about President Kennedy.
And we want to wrap up here kind of where we began. This podcast, Let Us Begin, takes its name from the inaugural quote from President Kennedy: "All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor perhaps even in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin." It's written on the walls of this building, pretty large font as you come out of the museum. What does this idea mean for you both, and what do you take from it?
It gives me hope. I love this quote because it's incredibly comforting, I think, especially at a time that can feel so challenging, and some of the issues that we face can feel insurmountable. And I think when we feel that things are insurmountable, often you think that it's not worth trying. And that quote reminds us that no matter where we are in the process, beginning is the most important step, and that there's always progress to be made, even if, it's not something that's going to be realized within, our time on this planet. It's worth committing to making the world a better place and participating actively in that vision. And I think so it gives me hope, and I love to come to the Kennedy Library and see it on the wall.
It is my hope that everybody who comes through the library and emerges into the pavilion and sees that quote from the inaugural address will at least reflect on 2 things at a minimum. One was just imagine what could have been had President Kennedy been allowed to live a full life. And the second is, would you consider in some small way even to answer his call to public service? And I think that so many people come through here inspired to reflect on, how can I serve more, make some small difference? And when we have middle schoolers who write essays for the Make a Difference Award and do something to clean up their park or their school or improve their neighborhood in some way, and we can recognize that, or in a bigger way with the Profile and Courage Award, really recognize the acts of courage that it takes to make the nation great. I think it is great that we can have history continue to inspire current events and action to improve our world. And I'm just excited to see what each generation will do with these same inspiring messages.
Rachel and Alan, thank you both so much for the conversation. It's always great to speak with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have come to the end of our special series, Let Us Begin President Kennedy's White House 60 Years Later. We're so glad you joined us as we took a closer look at the events from President Kennedy's final year in office and how his legacy lives on today.
If you haven't already, we have plenty of extra resources from the JFK Presidential Library's archives on our podcast website, www.jfklibrary.org/letusbegin. We will be back next spring with more interviews and stories from our regular podcast series, JFK 35. If you like this podcast, please leave us a review or comment. If you have a story idea, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org. Thank you for listening, and have a great new year.